in justice. The hope is the session will last for about an hour and a half. The session is sponsored or made possible by the Center for the Americas and the Senator George J. Mitchell Center for Global Peace, Security and Justice, both at Queen's University, Belfast, and the Cultures of War Research Group at NYU. Just an announcement about the final roundtable panel in our Race and Policing series, which will now take place on December the 2nd. That's a Thursday at 12:30 to 2, that's Eastern Standard Time. So we're still waiting for our third panelist, but I'm going to kind of introduce our speakers today. I'm delighted to be able to do so. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce, first of all, Frankie Y. Bailey. Frankie is Professor of Criminal Justice at the Rockefeller Center of Public Affairs at the State University of New York in Albany. She's a prolific academic critic whose work explores the intersections of crime, race, social history, and popular culture, and includes Out of the Woodpile, Black Characters, Crime and Detective Fiction from 1991, and Crimes of the Century, a 3-volume encyclopedia co-edited with Stephen Cha. As well as this, she's the author of 2 crime fiction series, one featuring amateur sleuth Lizzie Stewart, and the other a really excellent alternative future police procedural series featuring biracial police detective Hannah Mccabe, set in a near future Albany. The novels include The Red Queen Dies from 2013 and What the Fly Saw from 2015. Steph Cha, who I hope will be joining us, is the author of 3 novels.
Steph is here, Andrew.
Okay, brilliant. Yes. So Steph is the author of 3 crime novels featuring amateur sleuth and apprenticed PI Juniper Song, including Follow Her Home from 2013. At once an homage to Chandler's Marlowe, including some of the most exquisite prose descriptions this side of Farewell, My Lovely, and an implicit critique of all that Marlowe's vision occludes. She's also the author of Your House Will Pay from 2019, which examines the lasting consequences of the 1992 Los Angeles riots or uprising and shines a light at the contemporary injustices of policing and the justice system. Your House Will Pay won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the California Book Award. Steph's a critic whose work has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, US Today, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, where she served as the noir editor. And finally, David Schmid. David is the Associate Professor of English at the State University of New York, Buffalo, and one of the foremost scholars of American crime fiction and popular culture. His research focuses on Americans' unusual fascination with murder and murderers and the development of the popular culture of true crime in the US. He's the author of the groundbreaking study, Natural Born Celebrities, Serial Killers in American Culture from 2005, the editor of Violence in American Popular Culture from 2015, and the co-editor of Globalization and the State and Contemporary Crime Fiction 2016, as well as numerous anthologies and essays on crime fiction, urban culture, horror, and masculinity. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to talk initially for about, 5 to 10 minutes, maybe, sort of certainly 10 minutes max, just introducing themselves and their own sort of, sort of positions and views on the sort of subject for the panel. After that, we'll have some sort of, some discussion sort of between, all of us. And then maybe on around the hour mark, I'm going to sort of focus the attention on and around Your House Will Pay, and we'll think, kind of have some questions about that, but probably not a reading of that just because of time pressures. So anyway, I'll hand you over first of all to Frankie. So Frankie, can I sort of pass over to you now? You probably have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, so I am I guess I should start by saying I own a cat and a dog because that's upmost in my mind at the moment. It's really good practice for a mystery writer to own a cat and a dog because you get to see two sides of your life from that perspective. But in my day job, my other job, they overlap, and I actually get credit for being a mystery writer as a criminal justice professor because I also do research on crime fiction. So in my day job as a professor, I focus on popular culture, mass media. I'm looking at the intersections of race, class, gender, religion, sexuality, and all of that. And that carries over into what I'm doing as a mystery writer because I also look at intersections there. And my character, Lizzie Stewart, is a crime historian. She does what I do. The other character that you mentioned is Hannah Mccabe, and she's a detective here in Albany. I started out in the near future. I am now in the present in an alternate universe because the future caught up with me. Lizzie is back in 2004, so I'm not really writing in the present in either series. I have another character, Joe Radcliffe, who's in two short stories and is about to become the protagonist in what I hope will be a series. Right now, I'm working on a historical thriller set in 1939.
Oh, Andrew, you need to unmute.
Right. Thank you very much. Kind of Frankie, that's a sort of, kind of great, kind of introduction to you and to your work. Maybe David, I'll come to you next.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for having me be part of this event. It's a real honor to be on a panel with Frankie and Steph, so thank you for that. My interest in this subject in some ways goes all the way back to 1987 when I was a master's student doing an MA in critical theory at the University of Sussex in England. And I was at a time when I had to choose a thesis topic, and partly because I'm a first generation college student and partly because I'd spent the previous few months studying, very abstract material, I really wanted to write about something that was much more accessible and that would allow me to apply all of the theory that I had been reading to something more concrete. So at this point, I happened to come across a book by Elizabeth Cameron, Deborah Cameron and Elizabeth Fraser, called The Lust to Kill, in which they argued for the existence of a certain type of homicide that they called sexual murder that was only committed by men. And I immediately thought of a possible counterexample to this, which anyone in the UK would definitely be familiar with, and that is the Moors murders, a series of child murders committed by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. So I ended up writing my thesis about the representation of those two individuals in the media at the time the murders, after they'd taken place and while they were on trial. And that was my first introduction as a critic to the productivity of crime narratives and their ability to give us insight into a society's values, a window into what makes our culture tick. And after that, I was kind of hooked. And once I moved to America to continue my studies, the work on serial killers that I did just seemed to proceed organically out of that. And I think with reference to crime fiction in particular, I think of Frederick Jameson's famous phrase, "History is what hurts," in this context. And one of the things that strikes me about the genre of crime fiction is its ability to translate abstract concepts like power, justice, corruption into dramatic form that is compelling, engaging, and insightful. And here I'm speaking not just as a critic, but also as a teacher. Having taught crime fiction for many years, the reason, or one of the reasons it works so well in the classroom is that even students who have either persuaded themselves or been persuaded that they don't get literature, that they're not into literature, can take a class on crime fiction and enjoy it and get an enormous amount out of it. And it also enables me as a teacher to introduce discussion of issues in a way that again seems organic. And to illustrate what I mean, I just wanted to share with everyone a brief quote from the novelist Attica Locke, who may indeed come up for discussion later on. And Attica Locke says this about her work and her use of crime fiction. I think I get away with a lot of political stuff because of the presence of a dead body. If you have familiar signposts along the way, this is when the cops get called, this is when we tell the girl's parents, readers get comfortable, and then you can slide in all this other material. I just love that quote. And part of the reason I love it is because I would imagine, I mean, Frankie and Steph could obviously talk to this in a way that I cannot. I imagine it applies not only to creators of crime fiction, but certainly to teachers of crime fiction. And I find that the genre has this almost unparalleled ability to allow us to introduce and talk about subjects in a way that is not didactic, in a way that is not moralizing, but can still be very insightful and probing. So that's part of the reason why, all of these years later, I still get a tremendous amount out of studying crime narratives in general and crime fiction in particular.
Okay, thank you, David. That was great. So, Steph, maybe over to you. Kind of is that sort of kind of how you see the sort of the kind of genre sort of sliding in the the kind of the sort of political stuff while organizing a narrative around kind of a dead body.
Yeah, I really like that Attica quote. I think because I've thought that too. It's like the kind of concept of a spoon's full of sugar, except in the case of a crime fiction, the sugar is murder. But I think like when readers read for plot and entertainment, they will really buy into whatever else you're feeding them. But I think the other side of that is that a dead body, for me at least, and for I think for writers in the noir tradition, in any case, the fact of a dead body, I think, almost necessitates social commentary and excavation, because a dead body doesn't appear out of nowhere. I think when it comes down to it, violent crime is about the worst things that people decide to do to each other. And so when you're looking at violence in a society, you are looking at who is hurting who, what the result of that hurt is, how the system absorbs and deals with that pain, how justice is meted out or withheld. I think all of these issues come up very organically and necessarily when somebody is hurt by somebody else, because it brings in, I think, naturally ideas of law enforcement, policing, justice. And so I have found it to be a very natural outcropping of writing within the crime genre. And I kind of backed into this. I took a college class as a freshman in American detective fiction, and I took it as just kind of a fun English elective. I wasn't that familiar with detective fiction at the time. I'd read some Poe, I'd read some Holmes, but it was pretty new to me. And I read Raymond Chandler for the first time in that class as an 18-year-old, and I just, as an LA native, I found Chandler completely delightful and familiar in a strange way. This Los Angeles that paralleled my own in a different decade with different kinds of people. And so when I started thinking about writing fiction for the first time, I went back to this idea that I had when I first read Chandler. I said, I would like to read a book that's like a Raymond Chandler novel, but that takes place in present day in the Korean American community. And that kind of reflects the LA that I know. And at some point, I guess, if you are an avid reader and you don't see the book that you want to read, you maybe take a crack at writing it. And that's how I got into crime fiction. It wasn't necessarily because I had a deep understanding of the genre as a whole. I am much better versed in crime fiction now, 8 years after publishing my first novel. But when I started writing Follow Her Home, I was in my early 20s, and this was just I thought it was this one-off project. I was going to write this Raymond Chandler inflected novel. I was not familiar with series conventions, and I wasn't expecting to write another Juniper Song novel. But then when I wrote that first book, I started recognizing what I could do with the genre. And so I kept writing in it, and I think in the beginning I thought, when you're like in your early 20s and snobby, you want to do literary stuff and you care about genre distinctions, stuff like that, and I did at the time. And I kind of always thought that I'd dip in and out. And then book by book, I just realized how much I could do, the way that the politics and the social side of the genre just fit in so nicely, in a way that I feel like I would have to manufacture if I didn't have crime to talk about, And, it turns out that crime fiction just lets me explore a lot of the issues that I find deeply compelling. I think it is a really useful, incisive way to examine the rot at the heart of any given community or any given country. And so that's kind of why I have that's how I came to crime fiction, and that's why I stayed. And my first 3 books are PI novels. My 4th book is kind of more in that I call it a social crime novel. It's not really a mystery, but it has mystery components, and it's definitely a crime novel. But I think it's such a versatile genre, and it lets me dwell in these issues that I care about, with narratives that I hope make people care too.
Thank you. I mean, that was fascinating. I suppose, since we're in the sort of, kind of zone of the kind of history of the genre, we might sort of, start there in terms of sort of, kind of thinking about that kind of history, about its sort of association with kind of whiteness, perhaps, thinking about kind of Marlowe, and then thinking about sort of whether, kind of, or the extent to which sort of, the kind of genre, historically was able to sort of accommodate sort of, kind of insights into sort of, questions of race, how it sort of handled kind of questions of sort of race, and sort of, kind of how, kind of in the contemporary sort of, kind of writers can sort of reroute perhaps a sort of a slightly kind of problematic sort of legacy for sort of anti-racist and perhaps also sort of, kind of feminist ends, sort of is the genre sort of able to do this? Is it able to accommodate that? Is it able to kind of move with the times? Frankie, what you mean, maybe I can come to you first. I mean, obviously you wrote Out of the Woodpile in the sort of, the kind of early 1990s, sort of, kind of looking back at the sort of, the history of the sort of genre. What are your thoughts on sort of, kind of the sort of history question and sort of race?
Well, I started in Out of the Woodpile. I started with Edgar Allan Poe because that was the logical starting place. The history of the father of the mystery short story. And so I started there in that book. When I again returned to that to look at African-American mystery writers, I found myself going back to the colonial period and looking for those writers and trying to find where the first writer appeared who was actually dealing with crime fiction. And so I actually started back and followed Escaping Slaves, Frederick Douglass, and worked my way up. And so in that context, I'm always looking for the historical context for all of this. And in that context, I think when I follow that evolution, I can really see the point at which writers of color, particularly African-American writers, my focus at the time, where they began to join that conversation. So I think, if you follow the evolution, there's a point when we get to around the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and then we're getting to Rudolph Fisher and Chester Himes, and then later gradually female writers are joining this discourse, this discussion about crime and justice, and Pauline Hopkins, of course, is at the beginning. So yeah, I think there is an evolution. You can see those social issues beginning to appear, that discussion beginning to take place. And by the time we get to the 1960s, white male writers are creating Black male characters, and then the women joined the discussion, and then people of color began to join it in larger numbers. And so by the early 1990s, Walter Mosley, Eleanor Taylor Bland, Gary Phillips, those writers are beginning to appear, and they're beginning to take on those social issues that we're talking about.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. And sort of, kind of a fascinating sort of, sort of social history there. David, what do you think? I mean, does the genre historically have a sort of, kind of a race problem or not? I mean, looking at kind of, sort of critical receptions of, say, kind of, the early hard-boiled writers in the US.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I don't see how anyone could possibly deny that. I just want to take a moment, by the way, just to give a shout out for Frankie's book, Out of the Woodpile. For anyone here today who hasn't read it, make it the next thing you read. I mean, because it totally transformed my understanding of the genre. It's just an incredibly valuable piece of work. But I also would agree with you, Andy, that yeah, there's definitely a problem there. And I think part of the source of the problem, apart from just the fact that racism is a fundamental, fact of our society, is that crime fiction needs a murderer, it needs a victim, and it needs an other in some way, shape, or form. And for various reasons, that other has frequently been racialized, if not a person of color, literally. So, you could put on a very persuasive read-in, for example, of the orangutan in The Murders in the Rue Morgue as a kind of racialized other. It becomes more explicit later on with the infamous Andaman Islander in Conan Doyle's The Sign of Four. I think of, characters like the Filipino houseboy in Raymond Chandler's work, and you could continue to sort of multiply examples. And in some ways, I would say that this problem is even more acute. That is, the problem of racism in crime fiction is even more acute for a longer period of time than its representation of women, because everyone is familiar with the fact that, there's this justified complaint that women only featured in crime fiction for many, many years as a victim. But in some respects, people of color didn't even feature in that sense in crime fiction. And to me, when I think about why that is, I think of that remark from W.H. Auden in his essay, The Guilty Vicarage, when he says that, the victim needs to have a couple of qualities. They need to have enough people hate them, so there's enough suspects in their murder, but they also have to have enough people care about them on the reader's part, that we want to see the murder solved. And I think that for many, many years, the genre worked on the assumption that not enough people would care about a victim of color to really make them even a viable victim. Now, since then, we've obviously come like a very long way. And as Frankie indicated, there are various roadmarks along the history of crime fiction that demonstrate that racist history can be re-signified. And of the writers she mentioned, I would, emphasize in particular the significance of Chester Himes, partly because you also have in his work the other main focus of our discussion today, and that is policing, as well as racial justice. But also you have another great example of something that Steph was talking about earlier, and that is a writer who did not come to crime fiction as his first choice. Like many other crime fiction writers, he was basically forced into it out of economic necessity. However, when Himes began writing crime fiction, he talks in his autobiography about how he loved it. And part of the reason he loved it is that he realized that he'd always been writing crime fiction. He just didn't realize it until he actually sat down to write For Love of Imabel. And so crime fiction gave Himes a way to talk about the subjects he'd always been talking about, namely racial injustice, among others, but to do so in a way that felt much more satisfying to him, and that also connected with a much larger public. So this is a story, racism in the genre, that, you know, has a long history, but the good news is it can be resignified and done so very, very successfully.
Yeah, and one fantastic example of that is, you know, kind of Steph, your sort of, you know, Juniper song sort of, you know, kind of series, or, you know, and looking at sort of follow her home first of all. Can you talk a little bit about your sort of your relationship with the kind of Marlowe and sort of, you know, kind of Chandler, because it's very central to that kind of novel, isn't it? And sort of, you know, in some ways, you know, there is this sort of, you know, incredible sort of homage to sort of Chandler, and in other senses a sort of implicit sort of frustration of what those novels sort of, you know, don't show us in a sense, or sort of, you know, kind of what we see, you know, through Juniper Song's perspective that we didn't see through kind of Marlowe's.
Yeah, you know, I have so much love for the Chandler novels. I mean, they're still among my favorite novels, and you know, he's one of my favorite writers. He's an incredible stylist. I mean, I love him for the same reasons that everybody loves him. And I also understand that he had his limitations, you know, and that the LA that he wrote about was not one that that kind of it's a place where Philip Marlowe got to walk around feeling marginalized while also, you know, talking about the non-white, like non-straight people around him, and in ways that were, you know, less than exemplary, let's say, and that maybe have not aged so well. You know, I am always reluctant to hold individual writers responsible for a systemic problem. You know, I think he was one writer. He's a particularly salient one. You know, I think the larger issue is that publishing, you know, not just in genre, but across, you know, across the industry has always been and still remains pretty heavily white, you know. And I think, you know, non-white writers have certainly made strides. And, you know, I think finally we are getting to see some reorganization at the top of the industry, which is more important which is more important in some ways than who's getting published, is who's doing the publishing, who's doing the editing, who are the tastemakers and the gatekeepers. Because, you know, when Frankie was talking about that period in the 90s when Black crime writers were pretty ascendant for a while there, you know, that was in large part because of Terry McMillan, because one very bankable Black writer, you know, made the publishing industry go, there is a market for these stories. You know, I edited when I was editing at LA Review of Books, I edited a roundtable on the subject of Black crime writers, and everyone nodded at Terry McMillan and said all working Black writers should send her $5. But then there was this kind of little surge in the 90s, and then it proved itself to be this publishing trend, you know, and this market responsive trend, you know. And you're talking about, you know, the racial makeup of an industry that, you know, forms the way people think and conceptualize their world. And I think it's scary to treat that as trendy, you know. And I think that as long as the people who have the power to make these decisions all look a certain way and all think a certain way, you are not going to get any kind of change that sticks, you know. And I think there's a very active crime writers of color group now, which Frankie and I are both part of, that was started by Kelly Garrett and Gigi Canyon and Walter Mosley, because just so we have this kind of base of operations to kind of keep this foothold and make sure that this doesn't that this doesn't become a trend, that in another, you know, 5 to 10 years, you know, we are no longer marketable. You know, it's something that I'm keenly aware of too, because when I went out with Follow Our Home in 2011, I don't think it helped me at all that it was this like Korean American book. I think it was weird and, you know, not a selling point. You know, I think it made it kind of distinctive in a way that was not positive. Yeah, so I've seen how, and I feel like reversely, like I feel like I benefited from some of the swell in the late 2010s, you know, where I feel like Your House Will Pay got a better reception because I'm Korean American, you know. So I feel like there is kind of this ebb and flow to things. but yeah, I mean, certainly writing within this tradition, you know, I think it is important to be aware of what came before in a loving way. I don't think any of us are doing this because we hate the genre, you know, or think that it's irredeemable. But I think to do it in a way that understands the kind of shortcomings and the holes in the genre, and trying to remedy them in whatever small ways we can, you know, I think that is that is a responsibility that all of us have, not just crime writers of color, but, you know, people who select these books, people who even if it's just going to a bookstore, what do you want to read? You know, I think there has been this longstanding assumption, you know, and I think it's still pretty strong that white people only care about white people in this visceral way that drives readership. And, you know, you do see it even now I mean, this was the whole thing about the white woman who disappeared and like got like a million headlines, you know. Meanwhile, you know, countless Black girls and women have gone missing in the time that, you know, her story was in the news. And you know, that's a decision you see playing out in the newspapers in present day, you know, and those same people who consume true crime are also the ones who are probably reading mystery fiction. So that's, you know, this is still something that we are grappling with, and that we have to continue to grapple with, hopefully in a conscious, concerted way.
Okay, great. I mean, thinking about that, so maybe we'll sort of have a think about sort of, you know, what we think sort of fiction can do in a sense, you know, kind of crime or otherwise, but sort of fiction in relation to this sort of, you know, kind of, you know, perhaps the sort of, you know, kind of documentary or sort of, you know, kind of reportage on sort of questions of sort of, you know, kind of race and policing, you know. So across the series as a whole, you know, we've looked at, you know, kind of police massacres in the Rio favelas, or racist police practices in the Jim Crow South, or the ever proliferating tentacles of the kind of carceral system. But I wonder what specifically sort of fiction, what insights do we think fiction can offer us that sort of, you know, are beyond these other, or these other kind of forms and media can't quite get at? Frankie, so as a sort of, as an academic, but also as a fiction writer, what do you think fiction can do or tell us that sort of these sort of, you know, kind of perhaps traditional academic writing can't quite get at? You'll have to unmute yourself. Thank you.
So I started out as an English and psychology double major back at Virginia Tech. So I came full circle with the fiction writing, but I did that because I had first done the nonfiction with Out of the Woodpile, and started to go to mystery conferences, and decided I wanted to write a mystery novel. I'd done 2 romantic suspense before that when I was, you know, just fooling around trying to learn how to write. But you know, the thing that I find so compelling about fiction, aside from appealing to another audience that I can't reach as an academic, because most people don't read journal articles, but the whole idea of setting. I mean, my character in the South, Lizzie Stewart, is very different from Hannah Mccabe here in Albany. And it's because when I look at setting, I use setting as a character. I mean, that's a part of the story I'm trying to tell. And so actually I have much more going on with policing in the Lizzie Stewart series in terms of the social issues that we are concerned about than I actually do here in Albany, because in Albany, it's a different type of situation. I have a real place. I'm using the history of this city, and that's why I actually said it in the near future, because I wanted to have a police detective, but I didn't want to deal with what is actually going on now in this department. I wanted deniability. And I also wanted that with my mayor, who, when I had written the first book in the series, we had never had a female mayor here in Albany. And before my book was out, we had a female mayor. And so, you know, and so now this kind of alternate universe, this kind of setting that I've created my own, not a Marvel universe, but all of my books, all of the series, everything's connected together. I didn't realize that until I realized that Gallagher, Albany, upstate New York, the South, those places were connecting. And so I have characters in different places that don't really know about each other, but they're all coming together in that 1939 book. And that's because of those settings. So I think, in terms of that, it allows us to go to other places, whether other universes, alternate universe, different times, but also deal with the setting and what's happening there, and deal with how those characters are responding to that setting, and to bring the reader into that time and place. That's what's so important for me as I think about it.
Okay, thank you. Great. David, over to you.
Well, as I was indicating earlier, I come at this question, partly as a critic, partly as a teacher. And for me, a useful starting point is something that Slavoj Žižek says in one of his 10 million books, in Violence, Six Sideways Reflections. He develops this comparison between what he calls subjective violence and objective violence. And subjective violence is basically violence performed by a clearly identifiable agent. It tends to be very visible, very spectacular, whereas objective violence is the kind of violence that occurs behind the scenes on an everyday basis, that is often not visible and that we often overlook. And so if we apply that distinction to crime fiction, I think what crime fiction can do at its best is to facilitate that transition from subjective to objective violence. So in other words, the murder or murders that occur in a particular work of crime fiction can provide a gateway to examine the connection between those spectacular acts of violence and those more objective forms of violence, which are easily overlooked. So to give you an example, there's a terrific novel I don't think is read enough by Hector Tobar called The Tattooed Soldier, that is set in LA at around the time of the rebellion in 1992, and involves two Guatemalans who have come to LA for different reasons, one of whom is escaping from military repression in Guatemala, and the other is the head of the death squad who actually killed this guy's family. And they meet by accident in LA, and then the majority of the book is devoted to the guy whose family has been murdered tracking down and attempting to kill the leader of the death squad. So you've got a compelling, gripping story, but you also have both the LA riots and the civil war in Guatemala used in this book, not just as background, but also to understand how these acts of personal violence can be connected to more structural, much larger scale acts of violence. And that's what I think crime fiction does particularly well. I mean, another book that does the same thing to me would be Paco Ignacio Tebo and Subcomandante Marcos's The Uncomfortable Dead, which gives us, all of this information about both state violence and private violence in Mexico. I'd also point out Marge Schuval and Per Valo's police procedural series set in Sweden in the 60s and 70s. I mean, again, you can keep multiplying examples, but I think fiction gives us that ability to connect the personal and the structural in ways that, very few other forms can.
Okay, great. Steph, I mean, as a sort of, as a writer now, I mean, sort of, where do you see the sort of, the value of fiction in terms of intervening in these sort of bigger public events, histories, sort of?
Yeah, I think that bridging the personal and the structural. I mean, I talk about this all the time. I think of it as obliterating kind of the boundaries between the personal and the political, because I think it basically, I feel like the way that we understand our history, I mean, I feel like someone had a quote about this earlier about history being about the hurt. We understand our history through these stories of violence and crime. I think when you read the news, the headlines are about crime, a lot of them, and crime defined in different ways, but ultimately it's about intentional harm, and preventable harm. All of these things are kind of circulating. at such a rapid pace that I think it's hard for us to sit down and consume them in a way that to digest them as stories about individuals. You know, I think it's this kind of blur of people, and in order to preserve our sanity and also to realistically use our limited time, we're not able to drill down and look at each of these stories on the ground level and examine the people behind them. And I think that fiction can do that. You know, you spend 300 pages with the same set of people dealing with an event, you know, that might otherwise be read. You know, you could read a digest for that in like 400 words, but you know, you kind of get the story, and you care about the people, you know. And I think and I think this is part of the appeal of true crime too, you know, across many media, many types of media, is that ability to really go in depth. I think the extra thing that fiction can do is that, you know, the author just has an ability to create and pare things down and highlight things for maximal narrative impact. You know, I think because we're not beholden to any set of facts, you know, we have an ability to tell emotional truths and to tell larger political truths too, by creating a story that is not true, you know, a story that is not based in reality, or at least not entirely based in reality, that is crafted specifically to make whatever emotional or thematic or whatever point we want, right? I think a novel is an object that delivers a set of emotions, a set of responses, and a variety of readings. But it is a crafted artifact, and I think there is some power to that. You know, you can, like, we are able to kind of engineer the way that a story is told and deliver it for where it will hit hardest.
Okay, great. And I suppose the sort of, you know, the question of policing then sort of, you know, I'd like to sort of turn to that in a sense, and, you know, to think about sort of, you know, kind of how, you know, your work, you know, collectively sort of engages or sort of, you know, engages obliquely with the sort of, you know, the subject of policing. So maybe Frankie, kind of first of all, I mean, thinking about your crime series set in the near future, featuring, you know, kind of a police detective, sort of Hannah Mccabe. In some ways, you sort of make a point of not directly addressing that sort of, you know, kind of the sort of relationship between policing and race, but it's always sort of there as well. So I wonder if you could sort of, you know, kind of talk a little bit about sort of, you know, kind of what you hope to do in that sort of series, and, you know, perhaps with your sort of Lizzie Stewart sort of novels as well, but in terms of this question of policing and, you know, kind of and race as well, perhaps.
Yeah, with the Lizzie Stewart series, Lizzie, the criminal justice professor / crime historian, is actually the first person narrator. I have, now he is actually her fiance. When I started out, they didn't know each other. But I have a character, John Quinn, who was a homicide detective. And in that series, they actually meet in Cornwall, England, and end up in Virginia, but they travel a bit. But he actually, one of the things, and I have this first person or third person story on my website where he's relating this. She discovers in his second book in the series that he actually killed a teenager, a Black teenager. And so I wanted to bring that in. I actually have him in that short story, relating how that happened and how he reacts to it. But her response to that is a part of this ongoing discussion. The thing that brings them together is this interest in justice and, you know, how they see this, but they come from very different places in terms of how they get to where they are. With the Hannah Mccabe series, I'm dealing, because I'm a criminal justice professor, I was involved in an investigation with a colleague where we were actually brought in by a police department in upstate New York to look at stress among police officers. I did ride-alongs with female police officers and their partners. And so I wanted to eventually create a police officer, but I have to admit I was influenced by Eleanor Taylor Bland, who has this series of books, set in Illinois, and she had introduced a female police officer. And I looked at how she did that ensemble cast, and I wanted to do that, having had experience with that in my research and also in popular culture. And what I'm dealing with there is I'm looking at microaggressions. I think David referred to this a bit when he was talking about the everyday things that go on in terms of what happens if you're a police officer and you're female and you're biracial, Black, from her colleague's perspective, and how she navigates that and how she brings in things that they may miss when they're looking at what's going on. And I think that's one of the important things that a character of color does, is that voice at the table, or that voice in the precinct, looking at things and seeing it in a different way. But there's a character who hasn't been seen yet. The two novels came out, and then Minotaur began to reorganize, and I didn't have a contract for a third book. And they are actually going to come back in this 1939 thriller that I'm working. It's a parallel story. Howard Miller is a character who's not seen but mentioned in both of the books. He's a right-wing presidential candidate, and he was intended to come back in the third book in the series, where he is going to be in Albany with other presidential candidates. So he's actually going to appear in the 1939 book. And that's where I'm actually going to get into what's going on in terms of things Hannah is unaware of, that are going on behind the scene, in terms of how a small group of police officers in this department are actually a part of what's going on with this Howard Miller, this far right, presidential candidate. So that's where I'm going to bring it in, parallel to what's going on in 1939. Because as I was beginning to write that, I realized that there is a story that's happening in the near future that's related to the 1939. When I was talking about that universe and all of it being connected in various ways. So that's where I'm really going to begin to play that out in terms of how those things happening in 1939 eventually affect what's going on in 2021 and that presidential election.
Okay, brilliant. Wow. So such an ambitious sort of project between sort
I
of,
know it may be more than I can take on. We'll know when I finish the manuscript.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe I can turn to Steph next, in fact, because I just wanted to sort of think about, kind of your sort of insights into, kind of policing and the police, kind of in your fiction, because you obviously sort of choose not to, kind of have, kind of police point of view sort of characters. So sort of Juniper Song, a private sort of, investigator or amateur sleuth initially. And then kind of Your House Will Pay, you don't sort of you don't offer us a sort of or the police are sort of off stage, kind of to some extent, but the novel is very much about sort of police violence. So I wonder if you could sort of tell us a little bit about sort of kind of how you wanted to deal with the question of the police and policing in your own writing.
Well, the first practical consideration, beyond, I've never been that interested in writing a police protagonist, but part of that is a practical consideration, which is I would have no idea how to do that. Whereas writing an amateur detective novel, seemed like something that I could do, because I was just like, okay, I mean, because when you write an amateur detective novel, you're just like, what would I do in this situation? Okay, what would I do next? There's no bureaucratic stuff. There's no kind of office politics you have to deal with. You don't have to do like a lot of research. I'm a very lazy researcher. But in addition to that, I think that the relationship that crime fiction has with policing is like cozier than I prefer. I think because I think that this isn't necessarily like, there's nothing necessarily insidious about it. I think that crime fiction is I remember a lecture I heard on this in that freshman year college class I took, where my professor said that crime fiction is a conservative genre. She didn't mean politically conservative. She meant in the sense that you start at the beginning of the book with several, you like a few threads, right? And then the shape of it goes out like this, and then it converges. And that convergence and that reversion into a sense of order, I think, is one that is very optimistic. This idea that, at the end of the movie, the police come and everyone is safe. That's a trope, right? Like, and I think that because we have this desire to show the crime solved, to show justice served and order restored, I think that favors stories that do just that, and that don't allow for the real ugliness and tension that exists in the enforcement of laws by some people against others. And so I think that fraught dynamic is what I like to see when crime writers grapple with policing, rather than as just this transparent framework where, a delivery device for a story that is kind of reinforcing very positive images of a kind of orderly, just status quo that I think has never existed anywhere. And so when I incorporate police into my books, I'm not out to villainize cops, but I do think that the realities of policing in America and just the kind of the inherent tension that exists when you give a certain class of people the right to wield violence on behalf of the state. I think that's just an interesting question, and it's an interesting area. And so, when I talk about policing, I try to make sure that that's all considered, rather than just having a cop show up and solve crime, because that's not, mostly that's not what's happening here. I think it's a very imperfect system that we have. And I'm not really interested in telling stories that pretend otherwise. In the Song novels, I do have a cop who's a side character who Song is friendly with, because I think it's also I also knew it was a bit unrealistic to have PI novels where there's no mention of police when there are all these dead bodies popping up. But she's somebody who is on the side, and she's and is a character that I like. And when I started, I was almost done with writing Your Hasselhall when I realized that something I'd done in that book is that I had two characters in there. One was a journalist, but the other was a detective, who I think in other versions of my book would have been the protagonists of the story, the people who come in and parse out what happens, and the main characters would be like people they talk to for a scene or two. And I had that realization later, and I have a detective in there, but he's a pretty minor character. But he is a white dude. He could have been a different kind of narrator for that book. And yeah, so I guess when I think about policing, I just think about wanting to incorporate some of those nuances, into any story that I'm telling.
Yeah, and I love the sort of, the description of the sort of genre's sort of relationship with the police is potentially sort of insidious. And I suppose, David, in light of the sort of, the police killings of unarmed Black men and women, in the US, I wonder, is the traditional police procedural form fit for purpose? Perhaps not. Is this part of the sort of mythology, of the police that sort of, it wants us to sort of see them primarily as sort of crime fighters rather than, as Mikael Siegel put it, sort of violence workers. It's part of that sort of mythos that, and I wonder then, do we need to sort of relook at the kind of police procedural, and are writers doing that, sort of, kind of reinventing the kind of police procedural for, our current moments? Because, looking at even say something like The Wire, whether that sort of, is sort of, sort of now, you know, everything's moved on, and that no longer seems, you know, perhaps as persuasive or relevant as it once did. You know, it's just an example. But what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I would say, first of all, that it's helpful to take a long view of the relationship between policing and crime fiction. And one of the things that happens if you do that, if you think about the character of the prefect in Edgar Allan Poe's stories, or Inspector Lestrade in the Sherlock Holmes stories, you realize that crime fiction as a genre has a fund of representations of the police where they are stupid, ineffectual, and or at best a necessary evil. So at the risk of being flippant, I guess I would say one part of the equation for me is I would like to see more stupid, ineffectual, and necessary evil police in contemporary fiction, because, you know, the genre has given us plenty of examples of those kinds of characters. But as you indicated, Andy, the big shift that takes place here is with the police procedural. And I personally am not ready to say goodbye to that genre. I think it can be re-signified, but there are certain things that need to happen in order for that to be successful. The first is, I think that there's a really thin but important dividing line between humanizing the police law enforcement characters in a police procedural and turning them into victims. And I think that is one line that needs to be observed very carefully. And I'll give you an example. I'm a big fan of Don Winslow's work, especially the Cartel series. But in the midst of that, he wrote a novel called The Force, which is just a piece of garbage, in my opinion. And the reason is because you have corrupt cops. They are the focus of the novel, but they also turned in a bizarre kind of way into the heroes of the narrative in a way that, to me, is just absolutely repellent given the current situation. Now, there are plenty of examples of what I would describe as a more sort of responsible version of the police procedural. And again, if you go back in time and you look at the work of people like George Simenon or John Creasy, who also published under J.J. Merrick, or again, the Shuval and Varlo novels, all of those examples, I think you have police procedurals. And that last example is particularly interesting because Shuval and Varlo came to the decision to write crime fiction from a left perspective. They wanted to analyze the shortcomings of the Swedish welfare state and its systematic neglect of Swedish citizens. So in that sense, why would they choose to write police procedurals? That does not seem to be a logical decision to focus their work on functionaries of the same state that they want to criticize. But for them, it was a completely logical decision because the police, first of all, came into direct contact with all of the problems that they wanted to analyze. So it was a very pragmatic decision on one level, but also those novels, which collectively, the collective title is The Story of a Crime, humanize those police characters, but do not turn them into victims. And I think if you want to see what that distinction looks like, go and read The Story of a Crime. Also, I would say that the overall title of the series indicates that there is a larger narrative at work here, because what is the crime? For Shuval and Varlo, the crime is capitalism. And that's the crime that's being perpetrated. And yes, the police officers are implicated in that, but they also find a way to use those very same characters to reflect upon that larger structural issue. So I think, just as with any other subgenre of crime fiction, the police procedural can be written in such a way that it can be politically efficacious, but it's going to need big changes. And just one more I would mention, to me, there needs to be a sort of major, how can I put it, almost like a reassessment of the role of violence in the police procedural. For example, do police procedurals always need to revolve around murder? What is the role of murder in the police procedural? I think that should be a question that at least is now being asked. Should crime fiction focus more frequently on other types of crime, whether it be, you know, fraud or something that doesn't have that mediagenic quality that we immediately associate with murder. But that's one way to sort of push the genre out of its comfort zone. So I think there's a lot of possibilities available.
Okay, well, you know, yeah, I mean, sort of, you know, the sort of form sort of, you know, kind of changes, and the form has sort of always changed. And I suppose, you know, kind of we've sort of, you know, just to sort of, you know, perhaps tie up the sort of, you know, the first part of our discussion, thinking about that relationship between sort of, you know, kind of past, sort of present and future in the kind of works that we've been talking about. I wonder, you know, kind of whether sort of, you know, kind of at the moment you sort of see some sense of, you know, kind of, I don't know, kind of optimism in terms of a capacity that the sort of genre has to sort of learn from, you know, the kind of past, to sort of rework the crime story sort of in the present, or whether at least in the context of sort of, you know, racialized police or state violence, you know, we're dealing with just more of the same, you know, a sense of kind of ongoingness, a sense that sort of the problem has sort of just, you know, kind of remain the same, you know, kind of effectively, that nothing very much has changed. So I wonder sort of, you know, kind of, you know, as a sort of concluding sort of thoughts for this sort of part of the sort of session, whether, you know, you're kind of hopeful in the capacity of the sort of the crime story, if you like, to, you know, kind of to pursue, to drive, you know, sort of meaningful change. Frankie, maybe I could come to you first. And probably the mute, unmute.
Sorry, I always forget that.
Yeah.
What I'm hopeful about, I think writers of color are reaching a larger audience now than in the past, even in the early 1990s. I mean, when I was working on the book about African-American mystery writers, I did a poll of readers on Dorothy L. And I found most of them knew Walter Mosley and Chester Himes. And after that, there was a sharp decline in books that people had read. I know writers of color are writing about the things we're talking about, are dealing with those social issues and coming at it from a variety of ways. We have writers not only in the United States, but elsewhere, and they're dealing with different settings across the country, across different countries. And I think now, you know, particularly with organizations like, you know, Crime Writers of Color, and because so many talented writers are out there and are getting awards and are gaining attention, that now there's a cross section of people who are beginning to read or reading those authors. And I think that leads, that actually, in some ways, compels white writers to become involved in this conversation more, and to actually respond to what writers of color are putting out there now. And readers are looking for that, and it's a part of that whole larger movement going on, not just with our genre, but across genres, in terms of more readers beginning to discover those writers. And I'm hopeful about that. I think that's a part of getting everybody involved in the conversation and dealing with these intersections that we've been talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. David, I'll come to you next if I can, and then, you know, I'd like to sort of turn the attention a little bit towards, you know, kind of, you know, Your House Will Pay.
Right. Well, when I was a kid, my granddad wore glasses, and in his glasses case, he had a little cloth that he used to clean his glasses. And on that cloth were written the following words: "You can't be optimistic with a misty optic." And I love that as a kid. And to me, what I see as the meaning of that is that if you're clear-sighted, you will be optimistic. I think you have to be optimistic. That little cloth, I think, is just another version of Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I do have a lot of optimism for the future. And part of the reason I do is because I genuinely believe that crime fiction can be what Raymond Williams calls a resource of hope. It is one of those things that gives us the ability to see our society and our culture clearly, to understand how it works, how it can be improved, what the problems are and how they can be fixed. So unlike a lot of other people, I see the last few years in the US, despite everything that's been wrong with them, as a kind of challenge, a challenge to the creators of crime narratives to write narratives that address the issues of the time. And I know that's going to happen because crime fiction writers have always made it happen. So although there's a lot of reason for negativity and pessimism, personally, I remain very optimistic about crime fiction's ability to continue giving us those resources of hope.
Yeah, okay, and that's a brilliant answer. And sort of, kind of the idea that sort of crime fiction addresses the sort of issues of the time, I mean, leads very well onto, kind of Steph, your novel, Your House Will Pay. And, one of the jumping off points for this that you address in the afterword, the killing of Latasha Harlins in March 1991, and also in the two epitaphs. I wonder, if you could say something about why you wanted to sort of build your novel around this particular sort of incident, sort of what for you were the sort of ethical challenges of sort of fictionalizing this moment, this event, this piece of history?
No, I have such a my immediate feeling about the Latasha Harlins murder and my feeling still is extremely emotional, and I remember hearing this. So Professor Brenda Stevenson at UCLA wrote a nonfiction book about the case, and I heard an interview that she did on the radio where she was talking about this case in depth, and I wasn't this was in 2013, 2014. I grew up in LA, and I was 5, 6 in 1991 and 1992. So I was vaguely aware of what was going on in my city, but I had never really done a deep dive on any of this stuff. And hearing her talk about this particular murder, I mean, I just remember feeling absolutely stunned and having such a complex set of reactions because, so Latasha was a 15-year-old Black girl who was shot and killed. She was shot in the back of the head by a middle-aged Korean woman who was a shopkeeper. And, and I think that this is something that a lot of members of minority groups have in common, which is that there's this processing of group emotion of kind of these feelings of guilt and shame by association, this feeling of like, oh, like, was this person Korean? Like, what does that mean for me? It all feels personal, even though I have never, met Sinjadu. I don't, she's not somebody I know, but because she's in my parents' generation, because she is a Korean immigrant in the same city that I'm in, I feel connected to her, just automatically in the way that I feel connected to everybody in that community. And, also because from the outside, we are often judged as a community, as a group. We don't necessarily have the luxury of extricating ourselves from our worst actors either. And I'm very interested in social justice and in kind of the systemic pitfalls that allow people like Sinjadu to get away with murder. She was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and she served no jail time. And so on the one side, I had this kind of observer, a sympathetic observer, and me as a person who like understands that like Sinjadu is this like person in my community, and feeling just immediate guilt and shame by association. And I just knew that I wanted to write a book that tackled some of these feelings and that also looked at the ways that that 1991 murder echo in our present day. I think I was reading about Latasha, in 2014 when Michael Brown was murdered, another Black teenager, and the Black Lives Matter movement was starting to gather steam, and I just saw all these parallels, and so I wanted to put that into a book. This examination of history as an ongoing thing. That, and also one that incorporated, some of my feelings, and it's not an overly feely book or anything, but it's a book that I think that dwells in the emotion of these events, because I think that's where it gets sticky and complicated and interesting to me.
Yeah, because I mean, it's sort of, in some ways, it's telling this very sort of big story, in a sense, of sort of, these events that sort of happen, connecting sort of, kind of the contemporary with, kind of 1991, 1992. But it's also a very personal sort of individual sort of story at the same time, of lives shattered, of lives rebuilt, and of lives sort of shattered all over again. And I wonder, kind of, is that sort of what fiction can kind of do, coming back to that question? In other words, sort of, is it the sort of the particular kind of responses to these events on the part of your two main characters, so Sean Matthews and sort of Grace Park? Sort of, I wonder if you could just say something about what you were trying to sort of do or show us through their very particular kind of responses to what has happened to them.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I struck on the novel started as a short story that was basically about a Grace character finding out that her mother has this history. And then when I wanted to expand it into a novel, I realized that if I only told the Korean family's story, then it would end up being just this big apology for Koreans. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write a book that fully accounted for the humanity of certainly of the victim's family, and I kind of understood that, if I didn't explore Sean's point of view, that I would have done this cowardly thing of just making them into these perfect angelic victims, which is absolutely just not the point of the book. But Grace goes through something very dramatic, which is that she finds out that her mom is an actual murderer. I think that most of us don't have that kind of thing to reckon with in our past, but what she goes through is a sort of I guess a season of forced growth that I think that most Americans have or should experience at some point in their lives. Particularly I think non-Black Americans, because there's this we live in a country that was built on centuries of crime against very specific groups, and I think that the immigrant comes in and adopts this history too. I don't think we can just say we arrived here, our hands are clean. That's not how it works. I think part of becoming American and reckoning with Americanness as part of your identity is understanding what that history involves. And so, what Grace goes through is just realizing that all of this stuff, all this history, all this politics, it's part of her, and I think that that's true for everybody. I think whether you are affected by it through intergenerational trauma or intergenerational guilt, there is a part of your history that has been affected by the fact that your grandparents could or could not own houses in a certain neighborhood. You are, directly benefiting or being harmed by like that simple fact. That's just one example, right? And people talk about slavery as if it happened a million years ago, and then everything was magically better. But those effects are still very much ongoing. And so I wanted to look at these two characters who are forced to deal with that and to dwell with it, and for Grace, it's her, I hope that when people read it, they don't think about it as this Korean American woman coming to terms with her specific burden in America. I hope that people recognize that she is a representative for all of us, people who have to figure out how to live with the fact that this is part of our identity.
Yeah, and to tell a sort of crime story as well, because it's interesting, isn't it, that sort of, the kind of roles of, perpetrator, victim, sort of a constantly sort of shifting, and sort of one of the jobs we have as readers is to sort of, to try and sort of work out, kind of how this is operating narratively in a sense and generically as well. I was interested in earlier, you were talking about this novel as a social crime novel. Was that the term you used?
Yeah.
And I wondered sort of, kind of, if you could say a little bit more about sort of seeing this as a sort of crime novel of sorts, but sort of one in which you're moving or revising the component parts, as we read.
Oh yeah, and just kind of the way that incorporating the like actual history and adapting it to my own needs. Yeah, I mean it. I wanted to write a novel that felt like part of the real world. I wanted it to feel like it was happening right now in Los Angeles, present day. That was important to me. I didn't want it to feel like it was separated. And I also knew that I wanted to base it on the Latasha Harlins story specifically because of the significance that event had in Los Angeles's history. One side effect of this is that in order to write this as a novel, I had to erase Latasha Harlins from the historical record within my slightly altered version of Los Angeles. So that's an artistic decision that I made that could be considered ethically questionable, right? And for that reason, I try to talk about Latasha Harlins as much as I can when I talk about the book, and I put it in kind of everything surrounding the package. But in order to let these fictional characters breathe, I had to create an alternate version. But yeah, I wanted to root them in Los Angeles, and in order to do that, I needed to kind of look at this history and implant it as intact as I could, so anything that has to do with the actual shooting and the judicial outcome, I was very, very faithful. I changed some stuff, like I changed the ages of characters slightly, and and obviously everything in present day, kind of departs, but I definitely wanted to make this feel like it reflected the Los Angeles and the US that readers recognize, so that it would hit home, so that it would kind of feel relevant, in like a relevant commentary on the way we live, the way we process these stories.
But also the way that we as readers find out about these events, because you sort of find it's brilliantly paced in a sense, because we get a sense, we're not given all this sort of information at the beginning, nor is nor is Grace in a sense, and there's that sense of finding things out, or finding out what the relationship between these different these different individuals, these different families, these different events, these different histories, and it sort of unfolds sort of gradually. And I wonder if that's part of the sort of crime element. There's a sort of investigation of sorts, but it's not by a single, kind of character pulling it all together.
Yeah, it's an excavation of the past, and I think the past comes out in it's on an accelerated timeline, but in the way that the past kind of comes out for all of us, right? Which is that we find surprising little bits of family history or US history, just kind of as we live our lives. But it intrudes into the present day, and it's not necessarily our choice, when that happens or how it happens. And obviously, I was coming off of a PI novel background. I'm very aware of things like plot mechanics and suspense. I didn't want this to be a mystery so much as as kind of kind of an exploration of these two families. But I did want there to be a mysterious component. One of the things I was working with was the fact that I would guess that half of my readers would understand how the families were connected from the beginning just by reading things that I'd said or reviews or whatever, or like seeing the word Latasha Harlins, seeing the name Latasha Harlins in connection with my book, I think, or anyone familiar with that piece of LA history would be able to recognize it. And then the other half would have no idea. So, I tried to write the book in a way that would be satisfying to both, right? I try never, just from a craft perspective, I try not to rely too much on the element of surprise. Because I think you always you set yourself up to disappoint the reader when you do that. and so I wanted to make it kind of satisfying to both camps. You know, I think something that something that still strikes me about this ongoing story of, you know, violence against like Black children in the country is the relentless nature of it, and that feeling of just like inevitable tragedy. You know, this like you get resigned in this disgusting way to the fact that this keeps happening. And, you know, I wanted to explore some of that in the book too, you know, the sense that like all this stuff is like, you know, the characters make decisions, they act, but like a lot of stuff just happens to them and they are swept up in this current of history. And, you know, there's the sense that it's terrible and there's nothing they can do about it. And, you know, I think I wanted to live with characters who have to face that, who have to kind of find their footing, you know, despite events, you know, things that they can't change. And I think that's what most people are stuck with, you know, this absolute inability to move anything in a systemic or lasting manner, but to try to find purchase and to try to kind of find a safe little place for you and your family, like within these shifting currents.
So do you, I mean, looking ahead to the sort of end of the book, I mean, do you think you're sort of, I mean, in some ways there's, you know, there's a dialogue that takes place, a confrontation between, you know, the two sort of sets of family, you know, kind of involved. So the Grace and Miriam, and, you know, Sean and Daryl, who is his nephew. And it's sort of, you know, around the sort of background of sort of the impossibility, as you were talking about, of ever achieving a sense of sort of, you know, kind of racial sort of justice. So Sean sort of thinks rather than says they might never be done. And there's a sort of, you know, the sort of familiar sort of protest, sort of, you know, kind of, you know, sort of leading to, you know, kind of violence, uprising and so on, that kind of reflects back on what happened in Los Angeles in 1992, but also sort of, you know, kind of, you know, 27 or so years earlier, as one of the characters points out in Watts as well. So do you sort of, I mean, it's obviously up to us as readers to work out whether we're sort of, you know, kind of optimistic or despairing or both at the same time. But was your sense, you know, sort of a sense of just sort of bleakness and pessimism, that this is still going on and will always go on, seemingly, sort of, you know, or a sense that there can be, you know, if we focus on these individual characters, some recognition, some understanding?
Yeah, you know, I think it's broadly pessimistic, but with that little strain of hope that we can find meaning in this for ourselves, and that it's kind of on us to do that. You know, I think like, because I don't think, you know, I always knew that the novel was going to end this way, because I knew that in 300 pages it would be false of me as a writer to offer a solution to what are systemic problems, and to kind of solve racism, to solve injustice, you know, in a flip way in 300 pages. I knew that that was not something that I could do. And so what I wanted to show was more, you know, these two characters who are on their separate tracks, and at one point, just for like a couple paragraphs, they're seeing the same thing and kind of understanding the scale of like what they've gone through together. You know, that little moment of connection is where I ended the novel, because I feel like that was the most hopeful place where I could end it, because I don't think things go that well for any of these characters after this. But, you know, I think like we always read stories, you know, in the media, you know, often in fiction, where you know, there's a problem and it's solved, or there's something that happens and then we don't hear about the fallout. And I'm always interested in the fallout. And I think you know, something I wanted to do with this book was put these characters in like situations that don't have correct answers. You know, I think between Aunt Sheila and Sean, for example, I don't think either of them is wrong in their approach to dealing with the legacy of Ava's murder. You know, I think when someone you love is killed and the national spotlight is on you, I don't think there is a correct way to respond, and I don't think there's, there are surely there are incorrect ways, but I don't think either of their ways are incorrect, but they're completely incompatible with each other, and there's no way to get everything right. And I think for Grace and Miriam too, there is no correct way to deal with something like your mother being a racist murderer, because at some point you have to find what your values are and kind of balance them, and you're never going to come out of that clean. And I think I wanted to put everybody in situations where they're not going to come out of it clean, because I think that's actually the way we live. We don't actually have these easily solved moral things thrown on us every day that are like, yes, no, do you choose the correct path or do you choose the wrong one? I think there is a lot of searching to find the right balance for ourselves and figure out what is a responsible moral way to live. And I think the search for that is completely ongoing and very complicated. And so I wanted to make sure that I was able to show that, because because this negotiation is ongoing, because this negotiation is just life, I thought that the best I could do was show the kind of the like small amount of dignity that you get by at least struggling with it, by trying, by striving, which is another very American value, right? This striving has value in itself. That's what we tell ourselves. And I think it's true. I think that if the alternative is to do nothing, to think nothing, to take the path of least resistance at every turn, that is, I think that is also no way to live. But it doesn't mean that the alternative, the thoughtful way is an easy one or a clear one at any given point.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a sort of brilliant response to sort of the question of what fiction and sort of crime fiction can do in terms of, kind of its refusal to give us straightforward answers, easy answers, its refusal to give us sort of resolution as well. I mean, that's one thing that the genre is often sort of, critiqued for, that it sort of, kind of wraps things up too easily. And sort of, there are countless sort of, kind of crime stories that refuse to do that in a sense, in the way that yours sort of does so well. Well, I'm well aware that we've sort of, talked, has been so fascinating for the last sort of, almost hour and a half. And, kind of, I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A and, also sort of the chat. Now, this is not something that I've been sort of greedy with sort of, kind of my panelists here today, and haven't necessarily sort of called on, kind of everyone who's been listening in as well to sort of, to pose questions. But, kind of, I did also want to give people the chance, if there were things they wanted to kind of ask either David, Frankie or Steph, or, for any, kind of any of the panelists to sort of make any kind of comments or offer any responses to sort of anything that we've talked about as well. I see from Sharon, amazing insights from all three panelists. Steph, love your description of social crime novel. Can you say something about the ideology in crime fiction and how we push the boundaries of the genre?
Yeah, I think, and I think Frankie and David, you can feel free to answer this too. But yeah, I mean, Viet Nguyen, who wrote The Sympathizer, he after Biden was elected, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about writers after the Trump era, and it was kind of a call for writers to, write, because I feel like since 2016, during the Trump administration, and I think beyond, I think it's some of it has held, suddenly politics were okay to talk about in the public sphere and in our writing. But for a long time, and maybe still in certain parts of the industry, I mean, politics are considered gauche or something that you don't touch. And he said, but he carved out and he said that genre fiction has done a better job than traditional literary fiction in addressing politics and ideology. And I think that I think that makes sense. I think that I think to a certain point, if you are writing crime fiction and you are not including ideology in any sense, like what are you doing? Because I think your character should have a point of view. They should have opinions about the world that they live in, and the way they live should also reflect the world that they live in. And all of those things, they're ideological, they're political. So I think that crime fiction can go anywhere, because as long as you have these stories of extremity, of intentional harm, you're going to have to talk about these things.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. I mean, Frankie, can I come to you, in this question of, kind of fiction, crime fiction and ideology?
Yeah, I mean, in social science, we talk about the concept of standpoint, of where people are as the starting point for their ideologies. And I think it's inescapable for both the writer and the characters that he, she, they create to have some ideology. I mean, we're not, blank slates in how we approach things. And so I think, in my fiction, I try to have people along the political continuum in terms of those discussions that go on where they disagree with each other and actually have this ongoing conversation about various topics, because I don't want to have it only reflect how I feel about things. And I think that's a way that I can engage readers across the continuum, to have people reflecting various points of view, and not necessarily all being bad people or good people, but flawed people in terms of how they see the world and how they approach it. And I think that's what really goes on in a lot of good crime fiction, where writers are actually tackling that and having people discuss what's going on and approach it in a way that they're reflecting the readers and how the readers are seeing the world and trying to deal with those topics.
Thank you. And, on to you, David.
Well, I would say in terms of expanding the boundaries of the genre, one of the things I've been noticing recently is the appearance of more and more work that I would describe as sort of hybrid crime novels. And what I'm referring to is ones that embrace the possibilities of combining crime fiction with other genres, whether it be speculative fiction or fantasy or horror, or weird fiction. I mean, there's a great collection came out a few years ago called Down These Weird Streets, which is obviously like a play on the Mean Streets motif that has some really, really good examples of crime fiction that works equally well as other genres. And just recently, Nicole Glover published a really interesting novel that is in a series called Murder and Magic, that is both a fantasy novel and a crime novel called The Conductors. And so I think as the boundaries between different genres continue to become more fluid, that opens up new worlds of possibilities for not just the crime fiction genre, but for other genres as well. It also, I should add, opens up new possibilities for what we consider to be realism, because realism has obviously very often been sort of waved as the kind of banner that distinguishes good crime fiction from bad. And that's another category that I think we need to rethink. I think we need to broaden our understanding of what constitutes realism in crime fiction, because in that way, we open up possibilities for the genre as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Sort of three, kind of fantastic answers. Just looking at the kind of questions from Eva, then, do the panel have recommendations for police procedural writers who are working to reconcile the structural violence of policing with our need for the police to be the good guys in those novels? Any thoughts here from anyone? Maybe we don't need the police to be the good guys, sort of, in a sense. Anyway, Steph, sorry.
Oh, I mean, honestly, I have always loved Michael Conway. I think he actually does a pretty good job of, maybe because he writes one of these books every year, and Bosch is like an outsider within the police universe. I mean, so he, and he started as a journalist. I feel like these are books with a police hero where you know, and you know, not like I think like anytime you have like the outsider be like still a cop, I think there's like you know, there are tensions there too, but I think that he does a pretty good job of kind of, he doesn't ignore the stuff that we see like outside of our, you know, outside of our houses, right? Like he grapples with them, and that at least I want to see, and I do consistently see that in his books. But you know, that's, and I'm sure there are others, but he is one of the big ones who comes to mind, I guess.
And anything from either David or Frankie?
I would say, I mean, I know Eva, and I know that she's, you know, I'm sure she's already familiar with this work, but in the spirit of going back to earlier progenitors, I think another very important writer in this respect that we haven't mentioned up to this point is Tony Hillerman. And in terms of police procedurals that deal, amongst other issues, with sort of jurisdictional matters and the scope of police work and what constitutes police work, that is a really interesting resource still. But the other writer I would recommend, partly because I think he exemplifies what I was talking about a moment ago in terms of this blend of genre, is Stephen Graham Jones. A writer who, you know, I don't think gets enough love from a lot of readers, who continues to be very prolific, who writes equally well in sort of both horror and crime, and is really one of those writers that I think of as sort of blazing a trail for people that want to write crime narratives and want to read crime narratives that are don't really fit comfortably into any of the traditional categories.
And can you, any particular novel?
I'm one of those people that says anything and everything by Stephen Graham Jones. I mean, The Only Good Indian is a great novel by his, but his latest title, whose name escapes me, is more of a horror narrative, is really a great book as well. So yeah, I'm a big fan of his.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I thought this question was going to come up, so I did actually go back, and there is a website. I found this great book.com, where if you go to that, there's a display of covers from police procedurals by writers of color, and you get a good overview. You get a description, you know, links, so you can sort of look around and see what you find interesting. But there are lots of writers, and I don't want to name too many because I'll forget someone that I should. So I'm just going to cop out and send people to that site and to other websites where they can find information, including crime writers of color, of course.
And actually, I'm just gonna flag one of those crime writers of color because she's LA based, and I think she's fantastic. Rachel Hasselhall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really wonderful work
Yeah.
in the police procedural genre. She has also since written PI fiction, which I loved when she turned to PI fiction. She's a fantastic writer, but her Lou Norton series is if that's kind of your cup of tea. I mean, I think she's really worth checking out. She's a talented writer.
And in the questions from Marilyn, you know, Thomas King's Dreadful Waters series is also excellent. So, you know, kind of there we go. Wow. I'm aware that we've sort of, you know, kind of running, you know, kind of out of time, over time. And I'm, you know, sort of, you know, we've had such a sort of fantastic discussion, and, you know, the answers, the sort of responses from, you know, kind of all three, you know, panelists have been so insightful and so brilliantly kind of formed as well. You know, it was, you know, kind of, I was hopeful that it would be a kind of a fantastic discussion. It's exceeded my hopes by, you know, kind of, you know, many times. So I'm so thankful that, you know, you could, you know, kind of be with us to present your, you know, kind of ideas and to respond so generously with your kind of, you know, views and your time. You know, I've, you know, sort of, the time has just flown by, you know, kind of, thank you so much. And thank you, you know, kind of everyone who's, you know, sort of joined us from wherever you've joined us, you know, kind of, and just to sort of, to give our panelists a virtual sort of round of applause, you know, kind of for their interventions, for their thoughts, for their time, and for their insights. So, kind of thank you very much. And just a reminder that, the final session in our Race and Policing series will take place on the 2nd of December, on Thursday, 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. Work it out from there, wherever you are. And, kind of you can find all details on the Center for the Americas website at Queen's University. So thank you very much, everyone. And I think we'll finish the recording now, if that's okay.